The National Electrical Code, or NEC, addresses the support requirements for fixture whips, which are short lengths of flexible conduit used to connect luminaires, also known as light fixtures, to a junction box. The question is whether these whips, specifically those 6 feet or shorter, require additional support at the junction box. According to the NEC, the inspector's interpretation requiring support for fixture width 6 feet or shorter at the junction box is incorrect based on the articles cited. Let's break down the relevant NEC sections to understand why. Firstly, NEC section 330. B2 pertains to electrical connections for services, meaning the conductors and equipment delivering electricity from the utility to the building. This section does not apply to fixture connections within the building's electrical system. Service connections have different requirements due to the higher voltage and current levels involved, as well as the need for a secure and reliable connection to the main power source. Secondly, NEC section 348.30 AFI addresses the support requirements for flexible metal conduit, or FMC. This section specifically excludes luminaires, light fixtures, and fixtures from the general requirements for supporting flexible cords. The exception recognizes that fixture whips are typically short and installed in a way that minimizes stress on the conduit and connections. Thirdly, NEC section 410.67c directly addresses fixture whips. It permits a fixture whip to be unsupported in the ceiling, provided it is not subject to physical damage. This means that if the fixture whip is installed in a location where it is unlikely to be hit, bumped, or otherwise damaged, no additional support is needed. The rationale behind these provisions is that fixture whips are typically installed in accessible locations where they are not likely to be subject to mechanical damage. The short length of the whip, 6 feet or less, provides sufficient support to prevent it from sagging or becoming hazardous. The NEC recognizes that adding supports to these short whips can be unnecessary and add to the cost and complexity of the installation without providing a significant safety benefit. The inspector's interpretation seems to rely on a misreading of the NEC, applying requirements for flexible cords or service connections to fixture whips, which are governed by different rules. Flexible cords, for example, are more susceptible to damage and require more frequent support, while service connections are subject to stricter regulations due to their role in delivering power to the entire building. The requirements for flexible cords and service connections do not apply to fixture whips, which have their own specific guidelines. If you encounter this situation, communicate your interpretation of the NEC to the inspector, supported by the references you provided. Explain that section 330. B2 applies to service connections, not fixture whips. Point out that section 348.30 AFI specifically excludes luminaires and fixtures from the general support requirements for flexible conduit. Emphasize that section 410.67c permits unsupported fixture widths in ceilings as long as they are not subject to physical damage. If the inspector remains unconvinced, consider requesting a second opinion from another qualified electrical inspector or the local electrical code enforcement authority. A second opinion can help to resolve the disagreement and ensure that the installation is in compliance with the NEC. When presenting your case, be prepared to provide clear and concise explanations of the relevant NEC sections and the rationale behind them. Use diagrams or illustrations to show how the fixture whips are installed and why they are not likely to be subject to physical damage. Be respectful but firm in your position, and be willing to work with the inspector to find a solution that meets the requirements of the NEC while minimizing unnecessary costs and delays. In summary, the NEC does not require support for fixture width 6 feet or shorter at the junction box, provided they are installed in a location where they are not subject to physical damage. Understanding the relevant NEC sections and being able to communicate them effectively can help you to avoid unnecessary costs and delays while ensuring a safe and compliant electrical installation. The following is a more in-depth look at each of the relevant sections. Firstly, Article 330 of the National Electrical Code, NEC, covers metal-clad cable type MC. Section 330. B2 specifically addresses installation. However, the title installation is a broad term. The key is understanding which part of the installation requirements are relevant to the specific question about fixture whips. In this case, the issue is whether the provision mandates support for fixture whips at the junction box. It is important to carefully examine the language of section 330(b)(2) to determine if it applies to the specific scenario of fixture whips. Often, these sections are geared towards service entrance cables or other types of installations which are distinctly different from short fixture whips. The crucial point is that Article 330 generally pertains to the installation of metal-clad cable used for service entrances and feeders rather than branch circuits connecting luminaires. Secondly, Section 348.30 of the NEC focuses on the securing and supporting of flexible metal conduit (FMC). This section outlines the general requirements for how FMC should be supported to maintain its integrity and prevent damage. However, exception number 3 within this section is significant. This exception explicitly excludes luminaires, or light fixtures, and fixtures from the general requirements for supporting flexible cords. This exclusion is based on the understanding that fixture whips are typically short and used in a controlled environment, such as above a suspended ceiling. The code recognizes that requiring support for these short whips would be overly burdensome and not necessary for safety. The phrase "where flexibility is necessary after installation" is important. Fixture whips often need to be flexible to allow for adjustments or maintenance of the luminaires. Requiring rigid support would negate this flexibility and make it more difficult to work with the fixtures. The specific language of exception number 3 clearly states that luminaires and fixtures are exempt from the support requirements, meaning that the inspector's interpretation is incorrect. Thirdly, Section 410.67c of the NEC directly addresses the support of fixture whips. This section permits a fixture whip to be unsupported in the ceiling, provided it is not subject to physical damage. The key phrase here is "not subject to physical damage." This means that if the fixture whip is installed in a location where it is unlikely to be hit, bumped, or otherwise damaged, it does not need additional support. This section recognizes that fixture whips are often located above suspended ceilings or in other protected areas where they are not at risk of physical damage. The code does not require unnecessary support in these situations. The phrase "within a ceiling cavity" is also important. This indicates that the section is specifically referring to fixture whips installed in concealed spaces, where they are less likely to be damaged. The inspector's interpretation seems to ignore this specific provision, which directly contradicts the requirement for support. Understanding the rationale: firstly, fixture whips are typically installed in accessible locations. This means that they are usually located above suspended ceilings or in other areas where they can be easily accessed for maintenance or repairs. Because these locations are not typically subject to heavy traffic or other sources of physical damage, the whips are less likely to be damaged. Secondly, the short length of the whip provides sufficient support. Fixture whips are typically 6 feet or less in length, which means that they are not likely to sag or become hazardous. The short length of the whip also makes it less likely to be caught or snagged on other objects. Thirdly, adding supports can be unnecessary and add to the cost and complexity of the installation. In many cases, adding supports to fixture whips would be a waste of time and money. The supports would not provide any significant safety benefit, and they would make it more difficult to work with the fixtures. Understanding the inspector's interpretation: the inspector's interpretation may rely on a misreading of the NEC or a misunderstanding of the specific requirements for fixture whips. It is possible that the inspector is applying the general requirements for supporting flexible conduit to fixture whips, even though the NEC specifically exempts them from these requirements. It is also possible that the inspector is concerned about the potential for the fixture whips to sag or become hazardous, even though the short length of the whips makes this unlikely. It is important to communicate your interpretation of the NEC to the inspector and explain why you believe that the fixture whips do not need additional support. Be prepared to provide the inspector with the relevant NEC sections and the rationale behind them. If the inspector remains unconvinced, you may need to escalate the issue to a higher authority. Recommendation: firstly, communicate your interpretation of the NEC to the inspector. Explain why you believe that the fixture whips do not need additional support, and be prepared to provide the inspector with the relevant NEC sections and the rationale behind them. Secondly, request a second opinion from another qualified electrical inspector or the local electrical code enforcement authority. A second opinion can help to resolve the disagreement and ensure that the installation is in compliance with the NEC. Thirdly, document all communication with the inspector and any decisions that are made. This documentation can be helpful if you need to appeal the inspector's decision or if you encounter similar issues in the future. In summary, the NEC does not require support for fixture width 6 feet or shorter at the junction box, provided they are installed in a location where they are not subject to physical damage. Understanding the relevant NEC sections and being able to communicate them effectively can help you to avoid unnecessary costs and delays while ensuring a safe and compliant electrical installation. Remember to always prioritize safety and compliance with the NEC when installing electrical equipment. If you are unsure about any aspect of the installation, consult with a qualified electrical inspector or engineer. When addressing a disagreement with an electrical inspector, it's crucial to maintain a professional and respectful demeanor. Inspectors play a vital role in ensuring electrical safety, and their interpretations are generally made with the intent to uphold code requirements and protect the public. However, interpretations can sometimes differ, and it's important to engage in a constructive dialogue to reach a mutually agreeable solution. Begin by thoroughly reviewing the specific code sections in question. In this case, focus on NEC sections 330, B2 348.30 A3, and 410.67 C. Highlight the key phrases and exceptions that support your position that fixture whips under 6 feet do not require additional support at the J-box, provided they are not subject to physical damage. Prepare a clear and concise explanation of your understanding of the code requirements. Use diagrams or illustrations to demonstrate how the fixture whips are installed and why they meet the code requirements without additional support. Emphasize that the short length of the whips and their location in protected areas minimize the risk of physical damage. Schedule a meeting with the inspector to discuss the issue in person. This allows for a more direct and collaborative conversation. During the meeting, present your interpretation of the code requirements in a respectful and professional manner. Listen carefully to the inspector's concerns and try to understand their perspective. Address each of their concerns with specific references to the code and explanations of why your installation meets those requirements. If the inspector remains unconvinced, ask for clarification on their interpretation of the code. Try to identify the specific points of disagreement and work towards a compromise. Offer alternative solutions that address the inspector's concerns while still meeting the code requirements. If a resolution cannot be reached through discussion, consider requesting a second opinion from another qualified electrical inspector or the local electrical code enforcement authority. A fresh perspective can sometimes help to break the impasse and find a mutually acceptable solution. Document all communication with the inspector, including the date, time, attendees, and key points discussed. This documentation can be helpful if further action is needed. If necessary, file a formal appeal with the local electrical code enforcement authority. Follow the established procedures for filing appeals and provide all relevant documentation to support your case. Throughout the process, remain patient and persistent. Resolving code interpretation disputes can take time, but with a clear understanding of the code requirements and a professional approach, it's often possible to reach a satisfactory resolution. By following these steps, you can effectively address disagreements with electrical inspectors while upholding the principles of electrical safety and code compliance.